Thanks very much for having us along. Congratulations on your show, Dark Matter, here at Gallery 10, a fantastic achievement. You and I have just walked in the door 20 minutes ago, half an hour ago, and I guess you must be thinking a lot of things, feeling a lot of things, seeing the work all together like this. Can you just share some of that with us? Can you just, whatever's in your mind right now about how you feel about this work being together in the exhibition?
It's always interesting, the process working alone in the studio, say on a body of work over a couple of years. I mean, this is work mainly from the past year, but also it reminds me of what led up to that, what leads up to certain moments when certain things happen in an artwork, the points of departure in an artwork into the next artwork. And in particular, of course, we're talking about painting here. So when I walk in and I look at certain paintings, I see them afresh because it's in a different space. Usually, or most often in the studio, there's quite a lot of interference or clutter, the accumulation of paintings or material that I put up on the wall, which are triggers to maybe some of the themes or concepts going on in the paintings. So there may be sort of interferences which are necessary for the process as it continues through a series of paintings. But when one gets it to the gallery stage, we've made a selection of works. So you're thinking of a body of work in a certain different way. It's an edited selection from a larger body of work. And what might that mean? And what might the characteristics of it mean or be? And what would it add up to? So when I walk into the gallery, I'm thinking about all that. Okay, we're at the next stage of its dissemination. Where is it leading to? And so what we see is a body of work, but of course, perhaps people will take maybe one work, maybe someone acquires that, and then they're going to live with it. So then they make a choice in relation to the whole body of work, what appeals to other people. And of course it's a range of maybe very subjective feelings to maybe if they read about it, maybe being a bit more objective in terms of the concerns within the work. So it's interesting when you do get to the gallery, there's all that swimming around in my head.
Does this work and this exhibition in particular signify to you about your practice at this point in your practice, at this mid-career point, so to speak, but with many years experience under your belt? How have we ended up here? What is it that we can see that tells us something about what he said in his practice at this point in time?
Well, for me it's a peculiar place to end up. And you might have a disagreement with this, but I keep thinking, how did I come back to this? And it's a coming back to something, I think, because I trained as a painter initially, since I was a child up until probably the first year in art school after foundation, I was primarily painting. And then that stopped and I started making performance art for lots of reasons which had to do with the environment I was living in Belfast. So there's something about me reflecting back and thinking, well, how come I've come back to this? What's this about? There could be an argument for thinking of it in terms of something more solid in the artistic landscape or the cultural landscape, something that might have a longer life, because of course performance art's ephemeral. So there's something about the object, but then also with all the experience of all the performance work I've done, the focus on the body and the physical in time and space and what happens to the body. I guess what I've always been interested in making art and also in performance in particular, although one is present, there's going to be an absence in the presence. You're going to move through time away from that presence, but in some way you maintain a memory of that. It's almost like a kind of nostalgic reference for that moment. And I think that's what I'm trying to find in painting, are those moments in the studio where there's that sense of everything that I am that gets me to that moment, that in some way is conducted through my body to the surface. And for me, that's coming out of performance.
I feel that quite often artists are most interested in what they're doing at this present moment.
Well, of course, yeah. Of course.
And looking at earlier work can be, can seem naive, can seem, oh God, what was I thinking about?
Of course.
How come that stuff I'm doing now, or not just the stuff I'm doing now, or the stuff I know now, or I'm more in command of my abilities, I'm more in command of what I'm doing, so I think, because at that point you thought you were as well.
Of course you do, you always think that.
So I'm quite interested in that partiality. I'm quite interested in that sense of acceptance of what was gone before.
But you see, I can accept what's gone before, but I think there's been a real shift and split within me that is kind of separating myself from that.
Have you wanted to make that happen?
Yeah. As another matter of, I think, development and survival for my own mental, psychological, spiritual, psychic life. I've needed to do that. Because the other thing was, we've talked about this before, that I don't think I could go any further with that other work.
The condition, you've been working in a different set of conditions. You've adopted a kind of wholly studio focus, studio orientation. You've been focusing pretty much exclusively on painting for the past. When did that break occur?
6 or 7 years.
Yeah. So for 6 or 7 years you've been focusing wholly on painting, and your practice has been pretty much exclusively based in the studio. And there's been that constant and thorough process, and that's why the achievement in the work is what it is. So I think the context of how the work's produced has changed. Like you said before, the work you were doing before, and there was a lot more of kind of sociability to it. There was a lot more in terms of an interest in a network of artists. There was a lot more of a kind of site-specific or responsive or geopolitical sort of nature to it. So it wasn't coming out of the studio as if from nowhere. It was responding a lot of the time to a set of circumstances, which is why now things are so tied up in place and time, which is wonderful in some respects, but I think this work gives you an opportunity maybe in your own mind to transcend particular times and spaces and kind of think about things quite literally on a more sort of cosmic sort of global cosmic kind of level. And I think that's the difference between the work then and the work now, and it's about those circumstances of production and the circumstances of reception. So the circumstances of reception where that live interchange, that live encounter with others, with informed people, with people in the street. I remember some of the places we've been and some of the things that we've done. But now, of course, it's the viewer in the gallery, considering the painting, So I think that's what the difference is. But the concerns, the discourses, the character, the demeanour, and I think interestingly the poetry and the text is the one thread that runs all the way through. On one hand, you're yourself always keen to talk about what happens in the studio. I asked you about the exhibition, and you're keen to talk immediately about the studio, the place where the work's made. We talk about the painting, and then you want to talk about performance, and the conversation comes around quite quickly to talking again about this importance of physicality.
I have a feeling that it's taking that experience of the gestural, and as you rightly said, some of the initial coming back into painting was very gestural and very, very focused on large canvases and large spaces and trying somehow to find a way or negotiate that territory. So we are coming back on the first level of talking about the performative aspects of it. If I'm reaching beyond that, those questions of painting and the weight of the history of Western painting, for me there is a level of conceptualization in terms of what is it that I'm doing as a painter with that experience behind me, and what is happening and what does it mean on the painted surface. So there are ideas that are implicit in that. Now, if we look at this body of painting, there are very much ideas to do with perhaps a romantic idea of painting. And within that, we're talking probably ultimately about the romantic notions of death, life and death. And most painting is pretty much about that, basically. So, and I'm not saying, performance, I think in a way was about the immediacy of being in that position and life affirming in that position, because also it's a very social construction. This is something that's more isolated, and I am going to say that I'm going to come back to the studio in this respect, that it is about a kind of contemplative space in which you want to be left alone, and in a sense it's about a certain kind of mindfulness and quietness, although of course in the studio it's actually quite loud because I play a lot of music. But there's a kind of distilling coming down into a centre. Now, in relation to painting and that notion of a kind of romanticism, that idea comes from me through modernism. That's what I grew up with, that notion of the artist at the heroic centre of what they do, a kind of idea of existentialism, of being in control, or trying to figure out one's existence because that's all there is. So there are ideas of, I guess, on the one hand, a kind of a pragmatic notion of being in the present, but also something perhaps alluding to something more spiritual, whatever that means, rather undefined, and reaching into a darker space, a space that I'm heading towards, I think. So I'm coming from a dark space into a dark space, and I'm interested in all the things that as an individual egotistical human being impacts upon where you think you want to go. So actually, although they're very kind of nebulous and abstract on some level, these paintings, they are about things, and they are about a kind of a sadness, a kind of a sense of marginalization, of being outside of things. And I'm not saying this is particular to me, it's what I feel most certainly, but I want to make that connection with other human beings, that, do you feel this way? What's it like when you get to the point where you realize that we're only here for a certain length of time? How can you be in the day and be in the moment when you have the weight of your history, you have the weight of art history, and you have the weight of that in relation to where you're going?
You've talked about conversations a lot. You've talked about being in the world with others. How do you hope these paintings might act as conversations with viewers? What can viewers expect, or what do you want people to think about? What do you want them to have in their mind as they come around this wonderful show and look at the work?
Clarity. I want them to be clear. I guess I don't want the work to be then partitioned or placed or identified with other sorts of work. I want them to be seen just as they are and to be taken on their own terms, and that's a big, tall order, I know. But to come at it with a certain kind of generosity. So in a sense, that's what starts to complete the work, doesn't it? You know, it's like that Duchampian idea that the work isn't completed until something else happens with the work. You know, is it still, does it exist if it's somewhere else and I can't see it? Is something happening?
And Duchamp would also say that the viewer is the judge.
Exactly. And that's important too, you know. So, you know, I love the idea that they're quite, you know, malleable and people can come and do anything they want with them, and that's perfectly okay. People have told me all sorts of things about these paintings, which actually I didn't see, but of course that's their experience, and I wouldn't detract from that experience.